Warm Easter greetings. My name is Jenny Te Pā Daniel. I'm an Indigenous woman, a Māori woman born and raised in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I was baptised in the 1950s by an Anglican priest in a small rural church built and tended by my grandparents and by their parents before them. It was first from CMS missionaries who arrived in the early 1800s and later from colonial Anglican settlers who formally established the church in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that my understandings of being Anglican were initially formed. I've remained faithful to the church of my baptism my entire life, as in more recent times, as an academic theologian, I've had good cause to question and indeed at times to critique the fact that it's kind of no longer acceptable for an inherently imperialist and unapologetically patriarchal institutional bias to dominate our faith community. I have lived and worked in most of my life in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but I've also taught theological students and undertaken speaking engagements in many parts of the world. I have been heavily involved globally in the ecumenical movement and locally within the interfaith movement. From around 1989 until 2012, some 24 years, I worked firstly as a lecturer and later as te ahorangi, or dean, within St John's College, which is the preeminent Anglican seminary here in my homeland. I was the first Māori to achieve PhD qualifications in theology, writing on race, politics and theological education. It's always saddened me to find that over the years of my professional career, those leading seminaries and theological colleges across the communion still do not in any way represent the gender diversity of the global church, let alone in terms of ethnicity or clerical status. From around 2002 and then for the following decade, I was deeply immersed in working alongside three of the four traditionally described instruments of communion. In addition, I was a member of the Lambeth Commission, the Theological Doctrinal Commission, the Archbishop of Canterbury's Theological Education Commission. For the last Lambeth Conference held in 2008, I served as a member of the Bible Studies group, and in addition, during that same conference, I led a presentation on how to prepare Bible studies for the spouses group. I coordinated and chaired the first ever plenary session for both bishops and their spouses, and it was on the pressing issue of domestic violence within the household of God. I separately presented on the Anglican Covenant, and I co-presented on behalf of the Anglican Communion Peace and Justice Network, which I had chaired for around 12 years. I've attended four meetings of the Anglican Consultative Council, where I have variously led Bible studies and or presented on behalf of either the Anglican Peace and Justice Network or the Indigenous Peoples Network or the Inter-Anglican Women's Network, all of which I had a considerable amount of input into. In 2011, I initiated the first ever communion-wide gathering of principals or deans of Anglican seminaries or theological colleges. It was held at Canterbury. In the following year, I initiated a project known as GATA, or the Global Anglican Theological Academy, which was an ambitious project aimed at increasing the numbers of women leaders in theological education across the communion by first ensuring opportunities existed for those women traditionally marginalised from the academy, opportunities for them to flourish and to succeed alongside those more traditionally advantaged. I feel so blessed as an Anglican Indigenous laywoman from Aotearoa, New Zealand, to have been able to both to gain knowledge but also to contribute significantly into the work of the Anglican Communion. From my unique vantage point in the world, it has been so important, I think, to remind colleagues and friends, indeed sisters and brothers from other parts of the Anglican Communion, that not all parts are equal, that not all in the world know the sweet tastes of freedom, freedom to belong, freedom to succeed, to thrive and to flourish, freedom to become and to live as God would wish, freedom to live in peace with justice. And I think a good measure of that inequality and injustice is bound up in the colonial legacy within which the Anglican Church is heavily implicated. The Anglican Communion itself is an almost mythical construct to most ordinary Anglicans. However, as one who has already, as mentioned, been really privileged to work within its institutional bounds and to see it firsthand just how it's maintained and controlled as an instrument of both organisation and of enablement, I've also been able to develop a first-hand insider's understanding of both its gifts and its flaws. I can certainly identify with the positive testimonies of those who have contributed to these videos. From South Africa, Congo, Brazil, Pakistan, all across the world came very warm and appreciative affirmation of the blessings the communion affords. The blessings of forging friendships across the reach of the communion, the ability to share resources and of providing mutual support, of being involved in shared mission outreach from all corners of the communion, of bringing clergy and lay decision makers together, and of standing in the legacy of the historically established councils of the Church. It is the deep and enduring blessings of family connectedness across the cultural and geographic bounds of difference, which are so valued and so appreciated. But is it not also true that our wonderful Anglican Communion family has over the past 2 decades or so also been under severe stress, even to the point of fracture? It's so important to recognise that there is no centralised authority within the Anglican Communion. It is held together not by a solid institutional infrastructure, but by a beautifully well-intended and wonderfully theologically grounded concept known as the bonds of affection. It has therefore been cause for great sadness that these bonds of affection have proven incapable of holding the family together, and as a result, disputes and differences unable to be resolved have in some instances seen the breaking of those bonds entirely. Most often this fracturing has ultimately occurred within rather than between one or more other of the autonomous family units, which together comprise the 46-member churches or provinces, or those units known as extra-provincials. However, in some instances, there have been attempts to have entire member churches either punished or banished from the corporate activities of the communion, where their rightful choices to do with either doctrine or liturgy or their polity have proven unacceptable to other parts of the family. Now, these disputes have variously called into question the role of the Archbishop of Canterbury, especially where some churches see the Archbishop as the one responsible for mediating and potentially for resolving disputes, whereas as primus inter pares, or the first among equals, this is not his responsibility at all. So I think it would be good for students of Anglicanism to explore more of the actual role and responsibilities of the Archbishop of Canterbury. I think there are some good questions that could be raised about whether or not the Archbishop of Canterbury therefore needs to necessarily be from the Church of England, or could there be an Archbishop of Canterbury from another part of the communion? But back to the disputes, they've also called into question the efficacy and utility of the roles of various others of the instruments of communion. There have been various attempts at various stages to empower one or another of these into becoming a more authoritative and binding power-broking entity. Now, this proposal will never work because the only authority that is binding is that which is agreed and observed within each of the autonomous family units. So again, I say it would be good for students of Anglicanism to explore the ways in which the instruments of communion have withstood various attempts over the past 2 decades to refashion them as arbiters of disputes rather than as arbiters and advocates for Church's engagement with God's demanding and unending mission agenda covering the entire Anglican communion. At one point, it was being strongly suggested that a covenant be drawn up that would serve as a sort of agreed set of standards which in turn would be binding upon all member churches. It was also promoted by more conservative global leaders that there be punitive measures able to be invoked in the cases where a member church was deemed by other member churches to be in breach of the covenant agreement. So as one closely involved in the proposal development for the covenant, I could see it was both impractical and hypocritical. Impractical because there is no provision for punitive sanction among and between member churches, and neither should there be. And hypocritical because the entire process giving rise to the idea of a covenant was driven by the theologically indefensible proposition that the sacred worth of those created by God as our rainbow sisters and brothers was somehow acceptable for church leadership. It would be great for students of Anglicanism to consider all that has happened within the Anglican Communion over the last 2 decades, to consider the controversies arising which have led to considerable fracturing of relationships, to explore what caused the breaking of these relationships, and to consider whether or not the actions taken by all parties were consistent with the historically established spirit of the Anglican Communion. I have often been asked to identify what I think is needed to help the Anglican Communion to heal, and thus to enable all in the global family to truly know and experience those bonds of affection, those bonds which have traditionally been the basis of the links between all of the member churches across history, continents, and languages. I think that firstly there needs to be a concurrent radical shift in leadership and in institutional structures. Encrusted patriarchal structures of imperialised power and decision-making are seriously problematic in the 21st century. What is needed is a shift which enables the decision-making tables to mirror the communion of saints, and for the shape of the institution to become far more focused on the needs of the humanity it seeks to serve, rather than on perpetuating the self-serving structures of power which currently exist. For it is only the Church which ultimately models itself on the teachings and actions of Jesus, the Palestinian Jew, that will find itself capable of withstanding conflicts, of holding itself together, not for our own sake, but for the sake of those toward whom our mission calling to focus upon the least among us is surely to be prioritised. This is the Anglican Church. This is the Anglican Communion, to which I yearn to continue to be inexorably proud of belonging to. Kia ora tātou.